Hello, and welcome to Metachemistry. This is episode 83. Today, we want to talk about faction hopping and kind of what that implies to your gameplay, um, how that can potentially benefit you, some ways it might be holding you back, and maybe delve into some reasons why we've seen and experienced it. So just to kind of see, what keeps people moving around factions, and we know that of course this doesn't affect all players, but I think it's pretty common, something that I would see in the majority of Infinity players that I've encountered anyway. But before we dive in, we'd like to give a shout out to Mo Games, the sponsor of Metachemistry. Uh, Mo Games is an online Infinity retailer, which you can find at mo-games.com. And as part of that sponsorship, all of our patrons of any level get a 10% discount code to that store. And our Discord will do a giveaway every month for a $40 coupon code that is available regardless of your patron status. You don't have to be part of our Patreon in order to win those, and we give those out each month so you guys can get more cool minis to play the game that we all love. Because what's better than games? Mo Games. So, tonight we are on our skeleton crew with Ian and myself. Ian, how have your gaming endeavors been of late?
Kind of all over the place. Engaged in a lot of different pies, as it were. So as far as Infinity, been keeping on the Varuna train, getting some games there. It's been interesting. Like I gravitate towards a couple of different lists there, and so I'm trying to expand out from that and take things that I don't normally take to greater or lesser degrees of success.
Sure.
The last game did not go well, but that was fine. Still had some fun times with it. Uh, then outside of that, we're just about to start up another Blood Bowl league. We kind of keep that rolling constantly. BattleTech is a pretty regular occurrence as well, and I mean, there's always something else on the horizon. Somebody's like, "Ooh, this looks cool. Let's check this out."
Exactly.
So
Whole another
it's
topic.
yeah,
Entire game jumping.
yes.
Yeah, very cool. I've been trying to settle this internal struggle for myself. I've been jumping around factions lately. I know I've talked recently about playing Shazvasti. They have officially been pulled out of my main to-go bag for Infinity, so they're kind of back on the shelf for now. In their place, Steel Phalanx has shown up, because I always love me some Aleph. Um, and yeah, I'm thinking about making some other changes. I carry 3 sectorials on me at a time, in case, the mood strikes, or, I want to avoid a mirror match or something like that just might make things a little more interesting. So I'm probably going to hold on to Phalanx, Tunguska, and I think I'm going to put Rama in the 3rd slot. I'm going to begrudgingly pull out my OSS, which feels really weird. I don't know. I haven't quite settled on, because I need more magnets so I can magnetize the rest of my Rama. But yeah, otherwise, I've been playing some Shatterpoint. One of our local Infinity guys, we got a chance to play some Shatterpoint, and then my near wife and I, we've played several games over the last couple of weeks, which has been fun. So that's been neat, diving back into that as kind of a fun side pickup game, sort of a palate cleanser, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been good. But as far as kind of our main topic for tonight, faction hopping. When someone says faction hopping, what comes to mind for you, Ian?
Well, it comes down to a few different things. It's in a positive aspect, it's somebody that's looking to really get the most out of the game and experience what it has to offer, and so they're jumping between factions in seeing how they work and how things go together and if that's their play style or not, and kind of just makes for a very well-rounded player. There's also some negative connotations of faction hopping, which is that sometimes it's a player that's not having success with one particular faction, and so they jump faction to faction to faction, chasing that success, which can be done in some games. I feel it's very hard to do that in Infinity. Granted, you might just need to find that faction that jives with you, but since so much of it is based on like player skill and the choices you make in the game, and how factions with the inclusive rule set that Infinity has, that it makes it. I think the faction is to a great degree less of an issue of why somebody is or is not having success than their actual skill and knowledge of the game. So it can go in a couple different directions on that. Sometimes people are just looking for a challenge, and they've mastered this faction, they just want to try something else out.
Sure.
So faction hopping could be many things.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's not inherently a good or a bad thing, but yeah, I would say that usually the first thing that comes to mind was that second scenario. You have someone who is uh, part of the game and has had some experience with it, but is still, fairly early on in their Infinity journey. And there's this kind of uh, grass is always greener sort of mentality that can sometimes happen. Um, and it's really tempting, right? Where you see, like, okay, I played this game, I struggled against X, Y, or Z um, tools or tactics or, whatever particular units might bring. Like, okay, well, if only I had this other thing, I'd be set against that. And that is kind of the that's kind of the dark side of faction hopping, I guess. Um, and just to kind of preface, I feel like faction hopping, I feel like it's hard to have any sort of set criteria, but generally in my mind, I'm thinking if someone is changing factions more commonly than, once every several months, that's kind of what I think of when I think of faction hopping. If someone's changing every 3 or 4 months or less, that strikes me as faction hopping, which again is not inherently positive or negative. Um, but at least in terms of what I'm thinking, that's kind of the context that I would put in there. But Ian, like you said, there's a lot of potential benefits as well, right? Because if you find yourself struggling against a certain faction or a certain play style or type of tool, playing it and seeing yourself still lose is a really good way to find out what makes it not work.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, well, Cosmoflot is just ridiculous, or Phalanx is just ridiculous, or, whatever tags are just ridiculous, or whatever it is. You start playing, whatever X is, and you'll find out what stops those things because you're gonna run into them.
Yeah.
So, why do we faction hop? Now, Ian, I know that you jump around partially because you have a really large collection.
Mhm.
And so, if you ever want to have a chance of utilizing said collection,
Yeah.
you're going to need to kind of jump around to things. But I think that you tend to, I mean, especially since we've been doing the faction polls,
Mhm.
you've been pretty consistent in sticking to, whatever chosen faction for the entirety of the season. Um, but before that, I don't really feel like, or I don't really feel like I've seen you jump around like rapidly off the top
No,
of my head.
no. Like, so I own everything, and
Mhm.
a lot of that is because I do have interest in all of the factions and the sectorials and what have you. And I just go ahead and buy everything as it comes out and then fill in the backlog because, well, honestly, it's sometimes really hard to get a hold of the models if you don't get them right away. So
Sure.
it's one of those like, man, when I get around to wanting to play this, at least I'm going to have the models for it. But yeah, for me, like faction hopping for personal thing on it is more of a, I don't want to say boredom, but like I want to mess around with different things. And for me,
Sure.
it's not so much like this isn't working for me because I can make any faction work. It's that I have these and I want to play this. So for me, a lot of it, the when I faction hop, it's more one off. Like I'm gonna put this together, throw it in the bag, I'll take it out for a game night, and just have fun with it, and that kind of thing. But for what I do for like the seasons and stuff is more like we said. We started doing the polls, having the listeners decide what I was going to play, and then I stayed pretty dialed in on that for the season and then switch it up again. So, I can still be very competitive with that, but sometimes I do like to bring something else out just to see how it plays or just have a little fun with the models that I don't normally use because, little palate cleanser, as it were.
Sure. Absolutely. And I think that that's a very common thing for the majority of players who are in this kind of game for an extended period of time. That's eventually going to happen. Even with addition updates and rules changes and occasionally new units and profiles and updates and things like that, it's hard to stick with a single faction for the majority of players. Like I said, like even Andrew, is kind of he's a diehard Aleph player and stuck with Aleph almost exclusively for exclusively for a number of years, and picked up Shizvasti and Caledonia, I think, for someone who
And
never
Corregidor.
planned to. Oh yeah, and Corregidor, right.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things where I think that eventually you reach a point because you want to explore,
Hmm.
and I think that that is a very common thing for more experienced players.
Yeah. Also,
Just
the fantastic models don't hurt that
Mhm.
either.
Right, exactly. Like that. Um, that was actually one of the driving factors for me jumping into Shizvasti recently. Was that I think a lot of their models are pretty awesome, and they play very differently. So there's kind of a play style differential, which is nice. And I played them a bit, and I haven't. I've even did relatively well with them overall. It's not like I was just getting slapped around constantly, but it was just not terribly interesting. It felt like it was kind of there were a lot of tools that I felt like needed to be there in most lists to so I guess we can get into a little bit more specifics. Like one of the things that I would run into is that I felt like most of that was very fragile,
Mhm.
which of course it is. It's almost other than the heavy infantry tags, basically everything is one wound with armor two or less, um, and relies a lot more on camo and mimetism and things like that. And I found myself not necessarily enjoying that level of fragility, so I wanted to bring Shiskin or the Sphinx basically all the time, and you know it can be tricky to deal with armor sometimes. So I feel like having a speculo is useful in case there's an enemy tag or some nasty ARO piece or something like that. And so it felt kind of constrained in what I wanted to try and bring. Not that I always had to have all those things, but I always felt the lack of those things if I wasn't bringing them. Um, so yeah, I think part of it is they can make good hobby projects. Like I enjoyed spending some time painting those. I didn't finish, but it could happen. I could definitely paint the rest of those. Um,
Yeah, that thing I need to do.
yeah,
I'm real bad at getting the stuff painted, just to be honest.
So yeah, so part of it I think can absolutely be models or hobby projects. Like we had Bruno on a little while ago about Adepticon. Well, I guess it was a fair while now. It was Adepticon last year.
Yeah.
And like he had mentioned, he started Forco largely as a hobby project for converting a mercenary company and a new painting project and stuff like that. So I think that that's definitely a fun reason to just do something that has a very different aesthetic, something that has a different play style. Um, I think that's probably the most common one, though, is different play style. Something that, hey, I have this or that faction. I want to try something else that's very different and kind of experience a broader section of the game. But as we talked about already, like it can also be kind of a, someone chasing a particular outcome and thinking that another faction might give you that outcome. And that is possible. And this isn't limited to someone who's just trying to, find whatever the quote unquote best faction is. It can also just be like, hey, I'm trying to make this or that happen or, perform better. And this faction just isn't really jiving with me very well. Like if I had started Shizvasti, um, back in the day, would I have kept them? And if it were, if I were in today's mind, like I wouldn't, of course. Like I would not just be playing them solely. And sometimes that's it. Like I play Aleph because I like the, you know, highly elite units that are multi-purpose and are typically durable and things like that. That that's something that suits how I like to play well.
Mhm.
Ian, I know you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but how do you feel like faction hopping, and again, kind of in the context of semi-rapid jumps,
Mhm.
like jumping once a quarter or more frequently? How do you feel like that can positively impact someone's play?
I think that it exposes people to a lot more variety in the game, and they get firsthand experience with a lot more profiles and factions and how things are put together. And it makes, I think, a lot more flexible player in those terms because you have more of a wider knowledge base of the things that you're likely to encounter. Whereas if you stick with just one faction, you can often run into things that you don't know how to deal with because you haven't played against them. So, like, if there's a certain playstyle or a certain faction that's not really prevalent in your meta, and then you go to, say, a regional tournament, and then where you do encounter it, you may find yourself underprepared. Whereas if you kind of take it on your own to explore what some of those factions have to offer, then I think you end up being a little bit more well rounded, a little more knowledgeable about what you can encounter or what the options are in play. And then you're more prepared when you do encounter those to be able to overcome them.
Sure, absolutely. Like there's definitely something to be said for expanding your base of knowledge in the game. Because as much as it's important to know what your forces are capable of, it's equally important to know what your opponent can throw at you across the table. And you're obviously not going to have every profile in the game memorized. That's, exceedingly unlikely. But it's easier to remember, in my mind, anyway. I feel like it's easier to remember things that you uh, have played with. And so that can definitely give you a leg up if you have a more intimate understanding of what your opponent can throw at you and what are matchups that your units might be favored in compared to other units on the table. But it can also be problematic. And this is something that, I've recommended in the past is to try and stick with a faction for a little while. And it's
Hmm.
hard sometimes because if you are constantly uh, getting beaten up, it's hard to maintain motivation. And Infinity is a very punishing game in general. Most units, even durable units, things can go very poorly in an order or two, and they go away, even when it's very, very unlikely. But these things happen, and it can be difficult to kind of separate. Oh, I had poor tools, or I just needed this kind of unit, as opposed to, hey, this just didn't work out this time.
Mhm.
Whether that was poor placement or matching up against an enemy unit that was well suited to countering you, or even just bad dice rolls, because it does happen. Now, that's a whole nother discussion that we've had
Mhm.
before, and it can be dangerous to blame too much on dice rolls, but they are absolutely a factor.
Yeah.
And so, faction hopping, again, this is like semi rapid faction hopping like this, um, can really hurt a player who, and I think it's compounded the less experience said player has, because you don't get a chance to build up that base skill set. You don't have a chance
Mhm.
to lay your foundation and have strong fundamentals if you're jumping regularly and you're not gaining familiarity with the units that you're using. Because, as just said a few minutes ago, it's incredibly important to know what your units are capable of and also what your opponents can do. But if you don't know either, insert Sun Tse quote here, that, yeah, it can definitely set you back and compound the frustration that you're having,
Mhm.
because then, you know, you're still not doing well. And that can mean, that can come across as, maybe this game just isn't for me, or this game is wildly unbalanced. How can people, play like this if this is going to happen all the time, or whatever the case may be? Because there is a certain amount of resiliency that I think is required of Infinity players, because it is a very unforgiving and kind of punishing game. So, Ian, I think that you had a very similar uh, Infinity origin story
Oh
that I
yeah.
did, where like I am pretty sure I went my first year of playing without winning a game.
Yeah. Yeah. Against the same person.
Same person. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
So it's I played it for a year before I won a game, and then I started winning a little more regularly against that person, and then I got dumped into the wider scene, and it was like clubbing baby seals in some respects because it was like, oh, I actually do know how to play this game. It
right.
also didn't help that he would literally faction hop every game and throw something completely new faction, new list,
Yeah.
at me, and I'm like, okay, so whatever I just learned to deal with, that's not going to apply here. Like, it was
Right.
definitely the grinder method of learning Infinity. But
Mm-hmm.
I got a lot of experience against a lot of different things. I got to learn how to deal with those. I myself, during that time period, didn't really faction hop a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So I stayed pretty focused. But it was a thing where, I had to learn it. And that's where I feel like, especially early on, it is better to start with a particular faction, kind of stick with it until you learn the base mechanics that will apply to the game, to every faction, and then you can start
Mm-hmm.
really making those decisions and being better at your deployment, better at your movement, better at a lot of your which arrow is going to be the most effective, that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
I do think that there are factions that are harder to start with than others, and they're beautiful. I love the models. I think the faction is fantastic. I have seen way too many people get sucked in by like JSA
Mm-hmm.
and not stick with the game because they are a faction that I feel is a little bit more difficult to start with and learn with because of how they are tiered and how they're geared up to go into a very much a section of the game that is less effective outside of a very skilled hand and harder to engage with. And
Yeah.
that's CC. Like I said, like they can do the shooting, they can do a little bit of everything that everybody else does, but so many of their units are geared towards CC. The temptation is there to utilize that,
Right.
and I feel that they are one of the factions that is a bit harder to start with. Not that you can't be successful with them as your first faction, but you got to have a lot of patience.
Right. It throws you into a very different kind of play style that is fairly atypical of most Infinity factions.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a viable one, but it is, a little bit of jumping in at the deep end of the pool of sorts. But yeah, so there are times where it does make sense uh, to jump factions if something isn't working, but I think that should be an answer after some time is spent
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's
There's
very
times that we've recommended somebody change faction because they've
right.
been struggling with a particular one, and that how they're trying to play may be more suitable to this other faction. There are some of the best players that don't hop factions. They're very focused on one faction. I mean, if you look over at Ruben at Polynikes, he's played almost exclusively, to my knowledge, Combined Army for like the last 15 years. And he consistently takes, in the top 3 at regional tournaments, or, and if you look at the ITS rankings for the US, he's usually in the top 5.
Right. Yep.
And and he's very laser focused on Combined Army and vanilla Combined Army at that. So he's a top tier player, but that's where he's at. He doesn't faction hop. He's aware of everything else. He does his research, but that's the extreme opposite end of
Mhm.
where what we're talking about. So like, you don't have to play other factions to be successful at the game. You can
Of
laser
course.
focus in on one.
Yeah, and I mean, there are players where the temptation is either not very strong or kind of non-existent to jump around to other factions.
Yeah,
It's not common, but there are players that prefer that. They're
yeah.
like,
I mean,
this is what I like, so I'm
yeah.
going to keep doing it. It's work.
Or you look over at somebody like Tim Chainsaw, and man, he played a different faction at every tournament, and he's going to do well
Mhm.
because he's extremely good at the game and very well versed and flexible in how he plays. So
Yeah,
that works for him.
yeah. Same with Cobra Prime.
Yeah.
Rob's very much the same way in that regard. I think.
Hmm.
Like I see him usually playing a different faction most times.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's one thing to take away is that it's not inherently negative, but it can be hurtful.
Yeah.
Uh, Again, typically, the less experienced you are, the more hurtful it can be. Because one of the things I think that makes Infinity rather difficult is that there is just an absolutely massive amount of variables in play between what units and profiles you select in a list, what your faction is, how those things are combined together, how you end up, how you and your opponent both end up throwing rolls at the table, what said table looks like, and the type and amount and general architecture of the terrain in play. Uh, Also, those same things from your opponent's list and how they choose to play. Like, there's just so much going on that rapidly changing large swaths of those variables can make it really hard to identify what's actually going on or what's going wrong, rather.
Hmm.
Like, how are you going to learn, like, if, is it really that tags are just too strong and that, your faction can't deal with tags because you were playing, you know, some you're playing Shizvasti without long range AP options and relatively poor hacking, and so now you need to jump over to Corregidor so you get long range AP and hacking across the table. Like,
Yeah.
maybe if that's how you want to play, but it might also be that maybe the problem was poor deployment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be the same from one faction to the next if you jump. So, and just things to keep in mind as far as that goes. So, should we avoid faction hopping? And if so, how can we help avoid it? Um, Now, obviously, this is nuanced and there isn't an actual right answer, but I would generally say that
It depends.
it depends, right? The most helpful of answers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is that it's so subjective, right? It's not going to be the same answer for one person to the next. I could say, well, make sure you play a given faction for at least 6 months or a year before you switch to something else. But that's not necessarily the right answer for plenty of people, whether that's, again, either a play style mismatch or just someone who takes more or less time to absorb the rules. Because some players will catch on to things much faster than other players. And that can make a big difference as well. And so, what I would say is that it's generally if you are relatively new to the game and are having kind of mixed or low success, I would say it's worth checking. I mean, this is true kind of regardless, right? You always want to be checking with your opponent if you can to kind of get some outside opinion of what happened during your game. Was it that you didn't have the right tools and then your faction just doesn't really have said tools and you're trying to force something that doesn't really work? Or is it that you had the tools but didn't necessarily utilize them very well? And so, kind of getting an outside perspective, because introspection can be hard. I think introspection is hard for many people. So, getting an outside opinion, I think, can go a long way. And you might come to the conclusion that, yeah, it is, I've only been playing for a few months, but I bought into JSA and I realized that, I'd rather do more Quantronic warfare stuff than JSA has to offer. And running in with swords just gets my guys killed all the time because I have a hard time closing the gap. Sure, I think that that's reasonable. But I think, generally speaking, as kind of a rule of thumb, I would focus on finding out what's not working and then see if it is actually a faction related issue, because most of the time, I think it won't be. So, that said, Ian, what do you think? What are some ways that come to mind in terms of helping someone not jump ship?
Mhm.
Someone who's not trying to hop the fence to the greener grass on the other side.
Yeah. So there's a couple things I think that really talking to the other players in your community and getting their feedback on it. Your opponent on how did I do this game? What do you think worked? What do you think didn't? Do you have any suggestions? Like that's perfect. Farm that out to other people in your community. See what their opinions are, because there's probably somebody that's played your faction and has some insights and can kind of give you some guidance. Now, what works for them isn't necessarily going to work for you, but if they can give you some pointers or help, connect some different interactions that you can do, that can be very helpful. Another thing that I think is helpful is play a game, and if you have the chance, re-rack and swap your force with your opponents, and then that way you can see how they would handle what you've put down, and then you can kind of handle whatever they put down. But the point on this is see what they do with your list and see if there's any things that they do that you are like, oh, that's a really great idea. That, okay, how do I work that into my play style? Because a lot of it is, if you see somebody else do it, if you experience it from the other end, something you may not be having success with, but your opponent turns around, same list, and they can be successful with that because they are more experienced in the interactions and the faction, how the game is played, that kind of stuff. I think that there is a lot of learning opportunity there, but it is going to take, in many of these cases, it's going to take a lot of patience. It's going to take a lot of humility to kind of go that route of, being the learner and not being instantly good at everything. And it's going to take some time. But with a little dedication and persistence, and checking around with other members of your community doing some of these things, I think that anybody can be fairly successful with their faction of choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as long as people are comfortable swapping miniatures, which I think would probably be the main objection, but I think at least from like our local scene, I feel like most of us would generally be fine with most other players in the area borrowing models at the same table as us and swapping around. I think that's a really good idea, and one that I don't really see used often enough. But it's, a very pointed lesson, right? Like if you do the same thing, like, cool, well, here's what I would do with all of the same tools here on the same table against the same opposition, and see how it turns out.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that other things that might help are getting more feedback on lists. I think that can kind of help keep things sort of fresh and sort of help with, if you're running something and maybe you're missing important tool sets, or maybe you don't have enough redundancy in a certain aspect of a list, or, there's some other potential deficiency, or even just a difference to how someone else might play. That can be a fun way to kind of stick with it a little bit. Like, oh, well, here's what I played. What would you build? And I think that this is really interesting for people that don't play the same faction. Like if I, like how I were like if I were to build, say, some flavor of Ariadne list, I feel like it would look very different to what someone who is practiced in the faction would bring.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be kind of an interesting source of inspiration. Not because I'm, so accomplished that I would know such things and here's all the, novel things you could bring, but more of, I don't know what I'm doing with this faction, but these seem like things that might be interesting. And, maybe those aren't the things that are commonly taken in said list. So that can be fun in kind of soliciting others' advice that way. Having friends in your gaming group keep you accountable and,
Mm-hmm.
Inviting the shame. You're like, it's like, hey, I really want to stick to this faction. I've been having a little bit of a rough time for now, but try and make sure that I don't give in.
Yeah.
And having someone else help can sometimes make a difference there.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe have somebody else build you a list. So this is a very skill based game, and there's a lot of nuance to it. I'm not saying it's going to make you successful, but just seeing what somebody else's perspective on the faction can be super helpful. It's something that I enjoy because there are sometimes things that are available that you don't think of, or you just don't see the interaction. And one of the ones that sticks out to me is, it was several years back that I can't remember what his name was, but he won with Merovingia, and was it the Interplanetaria that he won, Devin?
Don't recall. Do you remember who it was?
I
I'm not sure
can't
who,
place it
but
right now. But anyway, this player won I believe it was the Interplanetario with Merovingia, and their lists were posted, and it was some discussion about it, and I was looking through the list, and it was like, wow, that's a very interesting choice. Thinking like I would never take this, and specifically what it was at the time, it was N3, and at that time in Merovingia, the Chasseurs had a profile with an AP sniper rifle that has since been removed. But
yep.
at the time, it was in there and he took it. And he had a very specific reason and walked through the process in discussing it of why he took it. And it was something that I had never thought about before. It was just, one of those like, oh, that's actually a super interesting reason to have taken that. And what it was is that his argument was that it was the highest damage weapon, that the highest chance of success that was in the faction. And when he broke it down, it was because there was no AP HMGs in Merovingia. You had some AP rifles, things like that. So this is damage 15 AP. So it's by default higher damage than an HMG because the AP reducing the armor makes it much more effective, just in general. And then because it was a sniper rifle, it was all about stacking mods. So he had mimetism, he had cover, he had long range, and he had very likely surprise attack. So right off the bat, he's potentially putting his opponent at a negative 12 modifier, negative 9 to negative 12, depending on the range band, to be honest. And so even though the ballistic skill of the Chasseur is only 11, he had very, very, very high chances of being successful because his opponent had very, very low chances of being successful. And through explaining that thought process and how he came to that conclusion and why he included it, it really kind of opened up my eyes to some of the different possibilities and combinations and stuff in the game at that point. Because that was a profile. I was like, well, you have an infiltrator with, mimetism and all that. Why would you ever take that with a sniper rifle? And then here's somebody that took that for a very specific reason. And it was very eye-opening because when, with the mechanics broken down by somebody. So if you can get somebody that can really kind of break things down for you and show you some different options, when that sometimes it's, hey, build me a list. Let me see what your thought process on this is. That can be fantastic. And I really highly suggest that, especially if you're struggling with a faction, do that. If you continue to struggle with a faction, also I say talk to the other players in your community, get their feedback, and ask hey, do you think maybe a different faction would fit better with my play style? Because there sometimes is a point to switch faction for that reason. And if other people are seeing that your play style really fits with this faction, might be something to listen to. Take them up on that and think about, what tools that faction they're suggesting offers versus what you're already using. That might be the time to jump that faction.
Yeah, I agree. So I know a lot of this discussion has kind of revolved around newer players and the dangers of faction hopping and things like that. But like we said, it's not all negative. And so, as far as times where it is valuable to move factions, I think that it's a good way to kind of enliven interest again. If you are playing a faction and you may be bored is the right word, or otherwise things feel generally somewhat samey, a new faction can sometimes really make a big difference. Um, and I feel like this is kind of where I've been at lately, where it's not that I dislike any given thing that I'm playing generally, but it's just not quite hitting the spot, not scratching the itch. And so I think that can be a really good time to try and jump. Now, you might have the benefit of a large collection and can just kind of jump, fairly readily, or it might be a little bit of an undertaking where you purchase into a new faction. But that can be a lot of fun, especially if they're fairly contrasting options. And sometimes if you're like me, you might find that maybe I don't like that contrast, and I like the way I normally play. But it is a really good way to kind of experiment and get some more life out of the game if things are otherwise maybe a little stale, perhaps.
Hmm. And sometimes it means doing an NA2 faction
Sometimes.
because a lot of the new, if you're well versed in a lot of the main factions, but sometimes the options that you have in the NA2 of combining, these different things from these different factions that don't normally go together, that sometimes that can breathe life into stuff. I know I've had a lot of fun playing with some of the NA2 factions. On all of last season, playing Foreign Company was an absolute blast. So, that could be a thing there. I mean, I had so much fun playing Foreign Company that, like, while I'm enjoying Varuna, I feel like they have so many similar tools that maybe it's like, maybe this is it's not as interesting to me, even though Varuna is a very interesting faction. But that's beside the point. NA2, lots of fun. Check it out if you're looking for some new options and challenges.
Yeah, it is an interesting mix sometimes. Like, I think that because they combine things in unique ways, I think that can be kind of interesting. Things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find otherwise.
Mhm.
So, like, like Foreign Company, I think is kind of interesting in that regard because you have, kind of the elite quintessential pano shooting of bolts, but you have this kind of monstrous close quarters combatant in the Uberfall Commando, which normally would not be associated with Pano. Like, even Pano units that are very good in close combat are nowhere near that level of effectiveness. And
Mhm.
you get the benefit of a couple units with Eclipse, which is not entirely unheard of in Pano, but pretty darn close,
Mhm.
since it's on uh, one relatively uncommon unit in the Guardia de Assalto in a faction that's out of print.
Yeah,
So generally speaking,
but they also bring in the benefit of nomad hacking and hacking
yep,
networks, which is
yep.
something that is just that level above what most of Pano does. So it altered some very interesting combinations and options.
Yeah, so like, oh, you can look across the table and see that there's this, this particular unit or did this type of play in a faction. Like, oh, this is very Pano-like. But then when you actually start encountering them or playing them, you realize that, like, I don't think of Pano being able to do that because, you know, it looks like Pano and it shoots like Pano, but it is not Pano. So yeah, I think NA2 is kind of an interesting option for trying to explore. And again, if you have the benefit of a fairly wide collection, you might inadvertently have the majority of things you would need to uh, play NA2. So especially things like White Company comes to mind,
Hmm.
Deshot, things that were sort of built off of combining both halves of a two-player starter.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah,
Shot's one of
there's a
my
little bit.
favorite in that regard. It just, the idea of let's take Yu Ching heavy infantry and combine that with all the kind of weird, like, sneaky stuff that Hawk has to offer.
Right.
And it's not 100% one way or the other. Like, there's some a little bit of back and forth in that regard,
Mhm.
but I think the combination that they can take is really cool. And so that's another one that, like, I suggest to people if they're looking to do something a little different with their factions and change things up that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that there are lots of good reasons and bad reasons to faction jump or faction hop. And, a lot of this is, personal opinion and, doused in subjectivity. But it's just one of those things that I think being communicative and kind of seeking out advice from other members of your local groups can go a long way in determining, like, hey, is this something that might be beneficial, or am I kind of shooting myself in the foot a little bit?
Mhm.
And, you know, it's not quite as easy as new player, stay with it, and old player, change around as much as you want. It's definitely not black and white in that regard. I think a lot of it is trying to think about what you're hoping to get out of that change and analyzing whether or not that change actually is going to get you what you're looking for. Because if you're looking for a different play style and you swap to something, significantly different, then sure, that very likely will be the case. But if it's I'm struggling with this faction and, moving over to this other faction should, get me better performance, well, it might or might not, depending on what the problems are. And that's kind of where you have to dive a little bit and see, is that actually what's holding you back, or are there other things at work? And with Infinity being as deep as it is, uh, it can be hard to tell sometimes.
Mhm.
But yeah, it is. I think that faction hopping can be a good tool to kind of keep interest in a game. I mean, any game really, but I think that most miniature games that this kind of happens is a pretty common behavior. But it's important to think about why.
Mhm.
Well, and with that, we are just about ready to dive into our final thoughts. But we want to say thank you to patrons. It's really wonderful that you're able to financially help support the show. It helps alleviate costs on us quite a bit. So thank you very much for that. It's it's really heartening to get that kind of support from you, and that all of you that listen to the show really appreciate you taking the time to do so. If you feel like you can and are comfortable with adding financial support, you can find us at patreon.com/metachemistry. And we have a handful of cool benefits that we like to give out in thanks for that support. So you can get things like early access to episodes. We have polls that you can join in on to kind of uh, steer the direction of the show a little bit, or what faction Ian's going to play for the season, things like that. And again, we greatly appreciate it. None of it goes into our pockets. Everything goes back into show costs. So this isn't trying to pay our salaries or anything like that. And uh, whether you're a patron or not, we'd love to have you on our Discord. And our Discord link is in the show notes. And it's just a supportive place to chat Infinity. We, uh, if you want to give us feedback on this episode or any other episode, that's a great place to do it. We have a dedicated thread for that after each release to kind of talk about it and hear your thoughts, because without you telling us, we don't know. And it's also a place where we can talk tactics, we can go over lists and get feedback. There's spots for painted miniatures or people's 3D printing projects or all kinds of things. So yeah, if you need another place to talk Infinity, stop by. I'd love to have you. But with that said, Ian, any final thoughts on faction hopping?
I think it's a very nuanced kind of topic and very dependent on the individual in question as to whether or not it's good or bad. And I think that, if you're really struggling with the faction you're playing and you're looking to hop, talk with other members of your community, see what their feedback is, see if they've got anything to kind of tell you about how you're playing or what interactions you kind of need to learn, or if there is a faction that's just better suited to you. Or if you're just, kind of faltering on the faction you're on, looking for a bit of a different challenge, jump into a new faction. There's no right answer to this question. It's more of a, do what you think is going to be the best option for you, and hopefully you end up finding the enjoyment and success that you're looking for, because one of the worst things for me is seeing somebody that doesn't get the game and then they faction hop a bunch and then they drop out of the game because they're not finding that success that they're looking for. And
Yeah.
I don't like to see people drop out of Infinity, especially for reasons like that. So said, try to stick with it, work with people in your community. That said, the game isn't necessarily for everyone. It is definitely takes a dedicated mindset in many regards to play this game and stick with it and be successful. So don't get locked into something if you're just not enjoying it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sound advice. That if you feel like you need to, whether that's you need a new hobby project or you feel like you just need a different change of pace tactically, or you miss a certain set of tools in your current faction, go for it. I think it's worth trying things out. Again, as long as you know why you are doing it. If you can answer why you're doing it and identify, that this actually is likely to fulfill that need, then I think that's great. And, I'd be interested to hear what you all are playing lately, if you've been trying new factions or uh, if you are kind of a diehard for the faction that you currently play. Let us know. Do you hop around regularly? Have you been playing the same faction since day one? Uh, I'd love to hear it. But yeah, it's ultimately no one can make that decision for you. But hopefully, some of the discussion points that we've had can kind of give you some ideas and help you consider if it's a good idea or not. But as always, thank you so much for listening to and supporting the show. And I've been Devin.
And Ian, and that's the meta.